Oh, well, welcome to the Media Roundtable, where we explore the business of trust in the new media economy. I'm your host, Dan Granger. I'm the CEO of Oxford Road, and you have tuned in for an important one. And if you get it wrong, you think that we're having a technical conversation. But if you can appreciate the gravity of what happens when you take a whole ecosystem, a whole media economy, and you change the incentive structure, the tidal wave, the tsunami of impact that can have in resorting a whole industry is really what we're tapping into today. We're going to talk about the impression. We're going to talk about exposure, and we're going to talk about some of the work that we've done with our AMP, Alliance for Measurement in Podcasting Task Force, with two people that were very involved in really all of it, but certainly with the work that we've done and recently released about the evolution of how we define consumption in podcasting. So we're joined by two folks. The first is Giles Martin, who we've dragged back onto the show a number of times recently for these AMP conversations. Welcome back, Giles. Who is one of the strategic architects of the framework that we're unpacking here. Giles, if you're watching him, you see he's got his Sunday best on today. He's got his top hat and his white tie and his tails. And Giles, we thank you for being. No, it was great. This is progress from last week. Truly,
in fairness,
I see it and I appreciate it.
Week. Sorry.
No, you're doing great. You're doing great. He even climbed out of bed for this recording. So his passion.
We don't know if pants are on. We don't know if pants are on.
We don't know about the pants.
I'm not moving the screen.
Anyway, thank you for all you've given to be with us today here, Giles. And then, of course, we have Pete Birsinger, who's the CEO and founder of Podscribe, a great partner in the business to us, and he worked very hard and is public and out with his contributions to the AMP task force. Thank you for joining us, Pete. And it's great that you're here for this conversation because you were the sponsor of the article around measurement of impressions. And I think maybe to start, can you give a little context about, Pete, what you do and how this particular aspect of the industry applies to what you bring to the marketplace? Why would you get involved in something like the download?
Sure. Well, first off, thank you for having me back again, Dan. I can't say my attire is drastically different than Giles's.
You didn't do a lot more, no.
Yeah.
No, but I didn't say collars were required, so it's fine.
Yeah. But anyways, yeah, kudos to you, Dan, and the Oxford team for wrangling a lot of cats together for this AMP process, which, I know took a ton of time and was quite a lot of effort to wrangle everybody together. So I think, first off, probably people say it, but yeah, kudos to you guys for wrangling everybody for, I think, sorting out the industry's most important matters and, seeing what we can all do when we band together. So yeah, I guess your question, what does this have to do with what we as Podscribe do? Podscribe, we do attribution primarily, and we help people understand that they get what they paid for, and then how well did it work. And how attribution works is it sits atop the data signals that come in. So if you put garbage in, you get garbage out. If you put, something mediocre in, you can only get moderately accurate results. So the quality of the input going into attribution, of the data going in, is perhaps the largest factor of how well we can do our jobs and give signals to advertisers to know how well what they're buying is working. So it was of paramount importance. It's probably, the most important thing, what we can get from platforms, which platforms can give us data. It's essentially one of the biggest things that's of the most importance to me. So I was honored to be there.
And Pete, so with respect to the attribution work that you do, I mean, I think most people that work in this industry, they understand that attribution, when we talk about that, we're really talking about measuring what people do after they're exposed to an ad, right? It's giving credit, it's attributing credit for the impact that media had on a brand's on some KPI that they're measuring, right? And are you saying that? And I know that's Podscribe may have started with one product offering, but has expanded to where attribution is a real significant part of your business. And I know you're working with a lot of different advertisers and agencies and publishers to give them better data. Can you do attribution without assumptions about consumption? How important is it to be precise about the exposure of an ad to understand the performance of an ad?
We can do it. We make a lot of assumptions in attribution. And yeah, I should have clarified with attribution, as you're saying, I do mean when an ad airs on a podcast, we can tell an advertiser how many people who heard the ad then went to their site and how many of those people wouldn't have gone otherwise and purchased. And we do make a lot of assumptions. I think a lot of assumptions are necessary to make in podcasts. For one, because the signals in podcasting off impressions, they're there and they're usable, but in some cases they're not as strong as what you might get in other channels. For example, we work primarily off listener IP addresses. We don't get basically ever a hashed email or a cookie or a mobile ad ID or any really sort of persistent individual identifier. So there's, to begin with, a number of assumptions that have to be made, but our aim to make the attribution more believable and accurate for advertisers is reducing the number of assumptions that have to be made. And I think most buyers of it and publishers would agree, the fewer assumptions we have to make, the more accurate the results will be. So I think that's a big piece of what was getting me excited and why I think this is quite important here, because I can list a long line of assumptions that are made, some more reasonable than others, but
well, and so Pete, in a second, I want you to walk us through what we ended up passing, which we've now made public, right? I want you to give just a jet tour of the decisions that were made to bring kind of clarity and closure where the industry hasn't made up its mind on some standards. But before you get into that, Giles, I want to just get a little bit of perspective from you. How do you frame the problem that we've been running into as an industry in terms of exposure? What is the magnitude of it? Why does it matter?
Well, it wasn't a problem for much of the early years of podcasting, and we accepted that the download was the currency of the business and it was all we had. And the IAB did some good work developing standards for how downloads could be reliably and consistently counted and measured across the ecosystem. And that worked well enough. It was really the introduction of video that has changed this so dramatically. And now you have a lot of podcasts being consumed on YouTube, for example, or on Spotify as video form, or these days even on Netflix and other video platforms. And so the download metrics that were measuring the scale of a podcast audience, they're missing all of those video viewers. So,
by the way, can either of you interject what percentage of true consumption in this industry you think is through downloads versus anything else, just to get a sense of what the currency was even capturing?
Great question. I'm going to ask Pete.
I would roughly say 50-50. Yeah, I'll throw out 50-50 out there. I could get into the reasons, but I'd say that might be conservative. Perhaps even more of consumption now is not a download, i.e. mostly a YouTube
Well,
video.
and even to make that statement, do we presume that a download equals an impression?
Depends how you define an impression.
Yeah.
Well, so I'm saying, so, you know, because I want to unpack the scope of the issue, right? And I think, Giles, you've been doing a great job, but we've got 3 primary distribution points that have probably 90+% of the consumption in the industry: Spotify, YouTube, Apple, right? And among those, download really is only the metric for one of the 3. And so this problem is, maybe there's 2 dimensions of it. The first is that you have a download which is about file delivery and not about actual consumption by a human, and treating that as though someone were exposed to an ad. And you can choose to run the business around something that is a proxy for listening or watching and not actual consumption. That's not even the only issue, but it is an issue. The other issue is that you're equating that across 2 other types of data, and it's the inconsistency of it compounded by the fact that the leading one isn't even actual exposure, right? So, Giles, kind of back over to you, but I wanted to get some numeric sense of how large an issue this is in the way that shows are bought and sold.
Well, and I also think that, you know, even before the sort of video era, if we can call it that, you know, a lot of people in the industry, sort of particularly sort of the forward thinkers, they're looking at the downloads metric and going, well, this doesn't really represent listening. But I think certainly in the earlier years of the business, at least when I was in it, I think a lot of people conflated downloads with listening. And I just think as the industry has matured, people have got a little wiser and they've looked a little bit more deeply into it. And as you know, advertisers have brought more money and they're sort of paying a little bit more attention. And so this is an inevitable aspect of the growth of and the maturity of the industry, I would say. And you know, really the challenges that we're wrestling with are exactly the same challenges that every media channel has wrestled with and continues to wrestle with since their inception. And you know, as part of some of the work I'm doing for some of the documentation on AMP, you know, I was researching what happened in the early days of radio and TV. And when radio advertising started, marketers were pouring money into it and there were no metrics for it at all. And one day someone suddenly said, can we hire this researcher to start trying to collect some data for us? And they did telephone surveys to start estimating what audiences advertisers are actually reaching with their dollars. And then that evolved into a more automated way of doing it. And then it evolved into diaries and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, media metrics evolution is an inevitable thing. And, you know, really we're just sort of on a evolutionary path towards better data. It's hard to fight.
It's hard to fight. And, you know, I think just a little bit of conversation around the stakes for the industry. You know, if I'm on the sell side, there's a way to exploit the ambiguity. There's a way to, you know, because there is not a standard that everybody adheres to and that can be easily audited, right? The quality of the impressions that you're selling can become a black box. If you're promoting a show and getting, you know, audience that isn't actually an interested audience, but it was the audience you could get to engage, you know, and dip their toe in, you can sell it all for the same price, right? So people start have the ability to kind of cut the pure audience with substitutes. And that creates questions about the quality of what you're purchasing. Then there's 3 different ways that it's being calculated, all 3 different, some based on getting a little closer to a human and some being more about file delivery that we use as a proxy, which again isn't necessarily even the biggest problem if it were consistent and people could all base it around a certain thing, right? But you got a lot of people flying by control in this industry, and they're trusting what they see on the dashboard because they've got no visibility when they look out the window. And what the dashboards are telling them is they've got, 6 different dials telling them different outcomes for things that should be the same. And like, you can use kilometers and you can use miles per hour, as and get the same, get some parity. But if they're not even measuring at the same rates, then everything's crazy and you may be in a tailspin. So it's an expensive problem for buyers who may not be getting clarity on the quality. We all trade in a CPM first, and then some advertisers may stay with a property because they see other things like response and they attribute ad performance. But most of the economy is really based on the value of these impressions and what they're purported to be sold at. And so there's just a lot of chaos, and I think it makes it harder for big advertisers to trust this channel. Even though it is such a high trust channel, it's sort of like we shoot ourselves in the foot, right? Anything else to pile on about the kind of pain and cost? Why should publishers even want to find some consistency in the way this stuff is measured? If I'm on the sell side, what's my motivation here?
Well, I think that a lot of those guys are asking themselves, exactly that type of question. I mean, I think that there is some value and some merit, although maybe it will be seen over a slightly longer time frame, in having some consistency in your reporting and being able to talk to advertisers. And as you mentioned, Dan, crucially, particularly bigger advertisers who have higher expectations in terms of data and metrics and planning tools and consistency, and ideally, tools and data that plug in and play nicely with all the other channels that they're looking at. But I think at the same time, there's inevitably going to be some concern on the sell side if this was adopted widely in the market. The transition would need to be managed very, very carefully in order to avoid the types of nasty shocks that the industry saw with the iOS 17 change. Now, obviously, that was something that was made on platform end. It was technical change, and numbers changed overnight. That's not what we're talking about here. But we're very mindful about that, and that's why we have done a couple of things. One was, we've been very clear that these new metrics, at least initially, are what we call supplementary metrics. So they are not designed to replace any existing metrics, and they can sit alongside the existing metrics that both publishers and buyers have in their dashboards today. But we've also worked on some what we called market guidance documentation to sort of proactively manage the transitional process in close collaboration with the whole market to precisely avoid any types of, nasty shocks. I don't know if that answers your question, Dan.
Well, it's definitely an important part of the conversation. And, I think when we're talking about what makes the industry afraid to change, it's a lot of what you're talking about. And Pete, I think, it would be great to get your summary of the iOS 17 situation. We need to have that in our mind. It's like the Northridge earthquake. Like we kind of have that standard in our minds. It's in it's in memory for many people, and you go, okay, what happens if there's another one and potentially even a bigger one, right? How do we prepare for that seismic shift? So I do want to hear from you on that, and I'm just going to kind of underscore back what I'm getting from what Giles already shared, which is like, okay, if I'm a seller of podcast ads, okay, or I'm a creator of podcast content, and I'm looking at the fact that, I expect to do more business this year, next year than I did the years before. Everybody has that desire and expectation. You're working hard. You're looking at your numbers. You're trying to improve it. You go, okay, well, we're going to go to a uniform standard. So the first question I ask myself if I'm on the sell side is I go, well, what if my numbers don't hold up with the rest of the pack, right? And then you go, all right, so it becomes a question of how confident are you in what you've been doing and the quality of engagement that you've been reporting? Have you been buying cheap impressions and arbitraging it? Okay, well, you're going to have some concerns about a rug pull where all of a sudden people can see, a spotlight on what your actuals are. That could be a concern, or it could be a place for you to say, well, we have confidence in the quality of our relationships with our audiences. We actually think we're going to show up well. But then they have another problem. And the other problem is they go, okay, I might have confidence in how I'm going to hold up relative to the pack, but what if none of us hold up? And what if what it tells us is that the file deliveries were not 50%, but 80% higher than the actual? And so even though I may be the best performer in the pack, I may over-index. If all our CPMs are tripling because it turns out we only had a third of the number of people engaging with the content, this is a big risk for the financials of a business, because if we just dump that data onto the market, there can be real shockwaves here. And so, Pete, why don't you give us some of that background and then maybe bring us ahead to where we actually landed on what we think some fair standards would be?
Sure. And just a slight thought experiment too for what we're saying. I don't think anybody, if they were designing an industry for long-term success, would say, let's have a purposely opaque metric that for half the impressions means one thing and half means another.
Oh, that's not that's a bug, not a feature.
I mean, if you're trying to start over or trying to think what's best for the long-term growth of an industry, transparency and uniformity and accuracy of metrics, I think it's hard to argue are best in the long term. I think, as you guys you're both saying so well, it's really the short-term reverberations that may reduce the publishers' perceived numbers that they have to sell or can sell on and increase their CPMs. That's likely leading to some friction here. But also, I think too, it's even more than that. It's the player cooperation, because publishers before have tried, such as NPR with their ad initiative, have tried before to move beyond the download to a consumption standard. So I think too, there's an element of platform cooperation that is also a friction point. In terms of the shockwaves you're mentioning with iOS 17, it was a couple years ago, and it was, I think some people, myself, noticed for a number of campaigns that were run of show, where you're buying impressions across every episode. For huge portions of these campaigns, maybe 30, something percent of impressions would go to like a small percent of listeners that probably most advertisers wouldn't really want. And then upon looking deeper, you could see, weird, it was just Apple listeners. There weren't like Spotify ones doing it too. It was like just Apple ones. And it turned out Apple maybe was a bit over eagerly auto downloading when you subscribe to a show and then you unsubscribe and you kind of mess with your settings. There was this edge case where some people, it could cause you to download dozens, hundreds of episodes of certain shows, particularly those with large back catalogs. So it affected the space disproportionately, I think was perhaps one of the biggest challenges, that shows with larger back catalogs were reduced much more so than shows with smaller back catalogs. And I think that's too the tricky part with this upcoming possible shift is that it's not just everybody goes down 50%. It's maybe some go down 70, some 30. You don't exactly, nobody, I mean, I don't think many people really know. Maybe Bumper knows some, but okay.
It's a really interesting point about the back catalogs, Pete. And I guess I've heard it before, but it was not top of mind for me. And it's an important one if there is a sort of uneven impact on different players in the market. What I wanted to ask you, and excuse me for jumping in, but based on what Dan just said, it does feel or seem that in this case, the delta between downloads and actual consumption is fairly it's evenly applied across the market, or the logic change, like it's it's a Boolean thing, like there's not going to be any sort of skew in how that impacts creators and publishers. The only real skew that Dan mentioned, I think is worth pointing on, is like the quality of your content. Like if you've got really good quality content and people are at heavy rates of listening, regularly to episodes, it feels like the drop off will be lower. Whereas to Dan's point, we know that there are people buying downloads in the industry who probably have inflated numbers. Therefore, the quality of the engagement with the audience is likely lower. That certainly seems to be the major factor. I just wanted to ask you if you see other factors creating that kind of uneven proportionality that you're mentioning.
I don't know of any that I'd be super confident on. There might still be some relationship with back catalog size, possibly because I don't know all the latest of how easy it is to mass download like every episode in a feed on Apple or Spotify. Maybe there's some button for that. And if there is a button, well, that would probably reduce the shows with bigger back catalogs a bit more, going to the play over the download, because if I click one button to download like 500 episodes of a show versus like 2, a much greater percent are not. So I'm just sort of hypothesizing here. I'm not sure, to be honest, with you, but I do think it won't be necessarily even. Everybody, drops 50%, I think. But I think that's why it's necessary. I think if it was just everybody drops 50%, okay, just double CPMs or whatever, and there's no difference. But I think that's why it's necessary, though, to make the market more efficient, so buyers don't have to try certain shows that they realize there isn't as much engagement. They can kind of find the better impressions or the real sooner, and it just cuts out some waste and perhaps decreases or increases trust right off the bat. So I think the point is, if it's going to be a little different, and if there wasn't, then it wouldn't be necessary, possibly, or as necessary, I think.
What is your favorite podcast other than the Media Roundtable? Is it Joe Rogan, Call Her Daddy, Mel Robbins, Crime Junkie, Amy Poehler, Smartless, Pivot? What are you into? It's such an interesting dinner table topic to ask people. You learn a lot, and people are so passionate about this medium. They're so passionate about it. And where do you listen? Where do you watch? Is it YouTube? Is it Apple? Is it Spotify? You are in the center of what we do as an organization. That is our business. We are Oxford Road, and we help some of the leading brands in the world be successful advertising in these channels. We're the largest specialist that exists. We buy the most ads in this channel. So we are actually powering this industry. We buy over $500 million of ads per year for wonderful brands like Shopify, Wayfair, DraftKings, Masterclass, Chime, Quince, AG1, Mint Mobile. We're interrupting all your favorite podcasts, including not just the usual suspects, but there are thousands in the long tail that are great niche shows with really loyal audiences. And what happens is when you advertise there, the host really only gets to pick one in your category. And so if you're the first there, you can kind of lock up that relationship, that annuity and be recommended to those audiences for years. So it's a powerful space. And it's one where we have the privilege of leading right now. We've got lots of great ways to de-risk our clients' campaigns, like our Orbit data set that's getting close to $2 billion of performance data. So we know what's going to work in advance. We also have Audiolytics, which are our proprietary ad grading system to make sure every word counts and is always getting optimized and then de-risked through our brand safety taxonomy as well, to make sure we watch out for your brand values. If you want to win in this channel, and you've got something to say, you got a product worth talking about, and you want to get into this trust economy, and you're serious about it, you really want to be a part of it over the long haul, we'd love to talk to you. OxfordRoad.com. You can subscribe to our newsletter if you like free stuff. It's called The Influencer, and it's free. We also have a lot of good thought pieces if you want to learn at OxfordRoad.com. That is OxfordRoad.com. Well, so we just went through all this with a lot of different stakeholders. And, remember the reason it'll be interesting to see in the history of this medium, how AMP fares. But one of the things we were very deliberate about doing was getting a cross section of the industry so that multiple interests were represented. And we were all pulling on we're all kind of playing tug of war from different angles. And that tension was by design, and in some ways it created some, inefficiency. But it was important, I think, for us to have buyers and sellers, agency, brand, creator, publisher, platform, measurement, representative, agent, to get all of those different interests chiming in. And going through that process, can you guys just, maybe somewhat quickly take us through where we landed?
Sure. I realized that was part of your last question to me that I didn't.
It's okay. It's all right. These are compound questions, and I should get better at just one at a time.
Yeah, I got distracted. So, to your point, I think I've been overly sort of harping on the going from download to consumption. But to your point, arguably even the more important piece of it all is the unification across platforms, which I think probably almost all publishers would really be in favor of, more so even than going from the download to a play. So to recap, two main problems I believe were addressed with the updated definitions. One, going from a download-based metric to a consumption-based metric, where we say a play now, you have to actually consume 30 seconds of content. And then the other problem it solves is that a download from an RSS feed is wildly different from a YouTube view. So the idea is that you have the same definition for each. And when you say you have one view and one download, it's as apples to apples as is reasonably possible. Because in earlier work, I think Giles and a bit myself found some data where it actually seemed the performance of YouTube views was a bit lower relative to a podcast download. The podcast downloads were worth a bit more, which maybe was surprising to some people, maybe not. But basically what that indicated was that the metrics were not equal. There's kind of a big difference. And, that either takes you a long time to figure out, or you work with a trusted agency who knows that, or you just never know it. So the ideal is now the metrics are actually apples to apples. So should I read a metric, or?
Can I just say one thing? Sorry, I know, Dan, you're keen to get to this question. You said that about the publishers sort of all sort of generally being on board with this. And I think it's important to highlight that there was quite a lot of, and both inside and outside the room, like some quite spirited discussion on this stuff. And some publishers and, other representatives sort of made the point that, a video impression could be considered very different type of inventory from an audio impression, right? Or an impression appearing on Netflix, on a Friday night might be very different from, somebody listening to something on RSS, walking the dog in the morning. and that they might want to monetize those separately and differently and have different conversations with advertisers. And I think that's important to acknowledge, because I'm sure there'll be people on the sell side, echoing that sentiment. And all I would say is, and I'm not sure this ever really came out cleanly in our discussions, but the fact that you have a consistent way of talking about, podcast impressions or the audience reached with a network, that doesn't mean publishers can't value the impressions at different prices, right, and sell them differently. It just means that when you are planning and looking at metrics, you can see in a consistent way, what did my podcast do? And we know that if you have a podcast audience, metric reported, that's faithfully representing in a consistent way the audience across audio and video platforms. So, and that in turn would, plug better into, agency planning tools or Nielsen's type of planning tools or whatever. So the fact that there can be a consistent standard of measurement doesn't mean that they can't be monetized differently, and doesn't mean that they can't be sort of discussed and evaluated differently, but it does give us a consistency and a standard approach to understand what podcasting is and what the podcasting listenership truly is and what podcasting is really doing for advertisers, no matter what format.
Here. And so I think, to your point, like the way we set this whole thing up was that we would have tension in the room deliberately. And we know that a lot of that tension was, some folks are, it was like there are audio purists and there are people saying there is no audio, everything is video now, like leave it for dead. And then you have people that are RSS, and it's not a podcast if it doesn't have RSS. And there's some people saying, no, that's not really the case anymore. And so bridging these things kind of requires that nobody would get exactly what they want, but everyone might have something that is acceptable. And I think in its purest form, like if we just use the media roundtable as an example. So when someone pays us $1 million to voice an ad, as they often do in this show, they're doing that because they think that so many people are going to be reached by that ad. And the fact that we're counting double on one platform and half on another, it just makes it really hard. Like right now, while we're recording this, it's 10:50 on the West Coast, which means it's 12:50 where Pete is, right? And Giles, I can't imagine what time it is where you are. It's like 8:50 p.m. Okay. So the problem the industry has is that, like, we can't schedule a damn meeting because somebody's got a 37-minute hour and somebody else has an hour and a half on the hour, and we can't do a simple conversion to make them all align, right? And so with all this, there's a lot of friction, and that friction costs money. And so there's a lot to be said for the technical. There's a lot to be said for the packaging. And are we selling a video unit separately from an audio unit? And maybe there are arguments, and that's where the market's going to go eventually. But if I'm buying a pure integration in a show that is distributed and consumed differently across different channels, you need that consistency, or else what are you even paying based on? And so we landed somewhere. You guys had a big hand in this. Do you want me to say where we landed?
No, Pete is finally going to get to it now. I feel very confident.
All right, I feel good. Pete, do you feel ready? Do you feel ready? No, it's fine.
I'm just going to go straight to it. A play occurs when a user consumes at least 30 consecutive seconds of a podcast, whether audio or video. And an ad impression is simply when any portion of an ad airs for a user. So the key point being, this should be the same whether it's on YouTube, whether it's from an RSS feed, and also it's consumption based. Even if Giles downloads 100 episodes of Crime Junkie and doesn't listen to any, it'd be 0. If he listens to a minute of each, 100 episodes, that's 100. So at least at this point, with any luck, we're moving to something that's consumption based, and then that it can be synchronized across platforms. So same for ads too. Like right now, an ad impression in podcasting, it's effectively download based. Your ad was downloaded, but you don't exactly know if it was truly listened to. With this new definition, some portion of it was listened to. You could argue maybe there should be 5 seconds or 5% or some minimum. And I think people were arguing for that. And I think there's a lot of valid points for that. But the key point in my head is that some of it was consumed versus before. Who knows? So.
Okay. And so how much of this do you feel is controversial where it landed?
I think the two tricky things in my head that maybe feel like there needs to be a bit more done on, or I think we'll have to see sort of what happens, are one, there were mentions of in every 24 hours, can you play it like 800 times an episode? I think we sort of punted on that a little bit to likely synchronize it with what the IAB does once per 24 hours, although YouTube, I believe, has a bit of a different standard. So we more or less punted to resolve that detail, I think, a little bit later. I don't think there's necessarily a wrong answer. I think just consistency across platforms is kind of the thing that was holding that up. So I don't think a lot of that was controversial. I think the tricky part is still that we can sit as an industry task force and all the key players were there, but still, regardless of what we say or may write down, it does require technical platforms to likely, in some cases, make some updates. So, of course, I think sort of that's the other piece. Well, I think there was a generally broad agreement. I think, the exact specifics are still, I think we'll still have to see for sure exactly how everything plays out.
Okay. And I know we're running out of time here. I do want to share that not everybody could go on record, but Spotify actually was able to step in and go on record. And what they said is that with respect to the 30-second play as a standard, this transition aligns with the recently announced podcast plays definition from Alliance for Measurement in Podcasting, AMP, an industry working group dedicated to cross-platform measurement standards. Spotify has long been committed to setting the standard for podcasting, and as a member of AMP, we're working alongside industry leaders to align on metrics that reflect true listener engagement. So that was very positive. And like you said, Pete, we need adoption here for this to be real, and it requires Spotify and other players. And I think all of us who work in the industry to decide that, hey, do we think we can get anything better than what we're proposing here? And if so, can you get consensus and get people to move? Or do we maybe have something here, knowing that nothing's perfect, but we might have something that is aligned across the way that we buy and sell, and that may be as close to perfect as we can ever get. So I think it was a big achievement that you got that across. What is it? I mean, is there anything profound here that either of you guys see in defining the play, defining the audience, defining the impression? Is there anything that's a real massive shock to the system in that? Or is this all pretty common sense stuff?
I don't see it being a huge shock to the system, personally. I mean, other than moving away from the download, effectively we're talking about 30 seconds of content consumption, continuous consumption, being the qualifier for show content. And that is not out of keeping with what, some very significant platforms in the industry are already doing. Obviously, there may be details in implementation and other types of sort of filtering that go on, but I personally don't see that as particularly sort of controversial or groundbreaking. I think the one thing that I would call out that feels pretty different this time is just the presence of advertisers in the group. Because this is the advertising community is not one that historically has been represented a lot in these types of industry initiatives, but at this point, advertisers are part of the conversation, and they're telling us what matters to them. And of course, they're the guys that are funding the industry. And I think that helps to push, these efforts with a nice bit of momentum, and hopefully gets people to sit up and take notice.
And if it goes well, what happens?
I think I saw a study from you guys recently about how much more advertisers would spend if they had YouTube measurement.
Yeah, we calculated a $1 billion plus floor on the opportunity. It is opportunity cost, but do you have a sense of how much value you think is being left on the table?
It's hard to put a number to it, but I will say when talking to new advertisers in the space, or even old ones, there's definitely always sort of a quasi unsettling feeling when talking to them about how a download doesn't mean your ad got listened to. And I think that there's just this feeling in podcasting that it's not quite as mature, not quite as ready for spend as other industries. Because of this, you have all these fragmented, wonky metrics. It just feels like it's not mature. So it's hard to say, put an exact number on it. But I think across all buyers, it increases confidence and maturity in the space. But also, too, maybe it's worth, to your question of the profoundness, I'm not sure about that. But if you think, like, why does why is this task force really necessary? And I think it's because we are in a space that is distributed and open by nature. So it's got a bunch of different people and players that can take part in it. There's not one centralized meta that can just, fix something right away or just do whatever they want. There's actually a lot of different people in this open ecosystem. So, the cause of this, I think, is still, it's worth it to not lose sight that it is a feature, that it is an open ecosystem where metrics are generally open and available. Whereas in other spaces, maybe they can be more centralized, but they may be less open. So, for instance, in Meta, you can't even necessarily get the IP addresses of who you're reaching. Granted, maybe you have a more uniform metric, but there are trade-offs. So I think it's worth keeping in mind to, why this is even necessary. So there are benefits of the space, I think, that cause this to an extent that are worth not losing sight of.
And Giles, I'm going to give you last word, but let me do one technical follow-up for either one of you. HLS, how much does that change the complexity of what we're talking about doing here?
Well, since you get the last word, Giles, I'll just jump in. I'll say I think it's amazing what HLS is. How I think it's a great precedent where Apple Video is saying we are going to stream the content from the actual hosting platforms. So then the hosting platforms can see who's downloading the content, which IPs, and how much of it, allowing the hosting platforms to be able to provide the metrics we're talking about here to, roughly know how much of an episode is consumed and by who. I think there are some quirks in the implementation that may make it not exactly perfect for this definition, but it's definitely by far the closest out of any other platforms, I'd say. So for me, it's amazing.
Yeah, in principle, it opens up a lot more visibility, that the industry's been waiting for. So certainly an exciting development in principle. I think the final thing that I would say is, one of the things that sort of we've started to talk about a bit more consistently, and that, I think both internally and perhaps on the task force and some of the research that we've been doing, it's just this notion of podcasting competing for advertising dollars with other channels. And I think we perhaps think about the growth of the industry in a silo or bringing in new advertisers, but there are a lot of advertising dollars out there that are being spent in other channels, and some of them have reputations as being, extremely trustworthy or extremely measurable. And case of Meta, for example, it's hard to get a sort of independent view on a lot of the data, as Pete was saying, that they're really providing, and the story that's really going on there. I mean, obviously, you can put the data into an MMM and run it that way, but all of these advertising channels have their own strengths and their own weaknesses, and podcast has its own strengths and its own weaknesses. But by evolving it in this way, yes, there are going to be some short-term, bumps in the road potentially, and tough conversations to have and things to work through. But this type of evolution should put podcasting on a better footing to compete with these other media channels for an enormous part of advertising dollars, and particularly from larger, more established brands. And I have a conviction that can only be a good thing for the industry.
Here, and I'm just gonna provide my own kind of final summary. Is creator economy estimates are about that it's about $250 billion industry and growing fast. Podcasting, I think, is actually maybe the most credible leg of the creator economy stool. I think it is perhaps the most influential, just because it is long form. It is driving decisions and engagement at levels that are a little different than social media. I would argue that for it to be getting 1% of the creator economy pie means that there's a lot of money being left on the table. Most people like this thing that we call podcasting, and most people kind of know what they mean when they say it. But it is time for us to grow up and get ready for prime time and move out of our parents' basement. And as an industry, and the fact that you have a download as the leading metric, which is a proxy for consumption, but not consumption. And then you have 3 different versions of consumption that are all getting stacked up and treated the same, even though they are not the same. And then you have an incentive structure that allows people to play a lot of fun and games to manipulate their own numbers, because there's so much confusion that actually leads to fraud, that you end up with a business that is undermining itself and eroding trust at every turn. And I think that, at the end of the day, like, we need to kind of unite and standardize to preserve the growth of a really powerful opportunity for brands and for creators and for platforms. So thank you both for the work that you've done to advocate for this. It's hard work, it's technical work, it's thankless work, but I think that the benefits will compound into the future. And I look forward to unveiling this stuff with you further with the big drop happening on July, where people will really get to see the detail behind this. So thank you, Giles, and thank you, Pete, and thanks for being on the Media Roundtable today. This podcast is brought to you by Oxford Road, where we want you to succeed in podcasting and its cousins in audio or creator media. And we want you to use your influence for good as members of the marketing community. We have the power to advance voices that edify and build bridges and make a positive impact in the world around us. If you're a marketer, you're looking to align your brand values with extraordinary business outcomes, please do reach out to our agency. It's called Oxford Road. You can go to oxfordroad.com and get that free newsletter called The Influencer. Pete reads it all the time. Pete, if people hear this and your wisdom and they say, I want to work with Pete on measuring things in this industry, where do they contact you?
Podscribe.com.
It's a good URL.
Or Pete. Yeah. Or Pete at podscribe.com.
Ooh, giving it out there. Thanks, Pete. Info@mediaroundtable.com. If you have feedback for us, check out Ad Infinitum. It's all about creative in this industry. And special thanks to not only Giles and Pete, but Haley, Bianca, Rocio, Kyle, Brian, Everett, Paulina, Neil. It's a whole crew. The team at Podcast One, as always, influence responsibly.